Forum. Starting. Chairperson, the members of the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus participating in this session of the UN Expert Mechanism, representing all regions, note with appreciation the report presented here on the second UN Seminar on Treaties, Agreements and Other Constructive Arrangements held in November 2006 in the territories of the Maswachis Cree in Alberta, Canada. In particular, we want to express our support for its recommendation to hold a third United Nations Seminar on Treaties, Agreements and Other Constructive Arrangements between states and indigenous peoples with the support and cooperation of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We note with appreciation the invitation of the Maori of Aotearoa, New Zealand in this regard. In this way, important advances can continue to be made regarding implementation, consideration of developments and good practices, and implications of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the United Nations General Assembly. This includes the growing endorsement of the declaration, including by UN member states that had voted against or had abstained from voting during the adoption of the declaration by the General Assembly. The Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus takes this opportunity to affirm its support for the recommendations contained in the final report of the UN study on treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements between states and indigenous populations, which is UN document E/CN.4/sub.2/1990/20 by Special Rapporteur Dr. Miguel Alfonso Martinez. We look forward to continue to work to advance the implementation of this treaty recommendations in partnership with states and the UN system. However, we also take this opportunity to state that we do not necessarily agree with certain provisions contained in the body of the treaty study report by Special Rapporteur Alfonso Martinez under the category of, I quote, some key points of departure, unquote, in which the validity of the claims of indigenousness by peoples in Asia and Africa were questioned. And if I just add in my personal capacity, I know that this matter was raised, amongst others, by indigenous participants from Asia, Africa, the Arctic, North America and other regions at the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1998 or 99, and at the first expert seminar on the subject in 2003. I return, Mr. Chairperson, to the statement on behalf of the caucus. We again affirm the validity, soundness and relevance of the recommendations contained in this report. However, we wish to put on record the right to self-identify of the indigenous peoples of Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe and all other regions. Equal application of the rights of indigenous peoples of all regions, including indigenous peoples in Asia and Africa, is vital to take forward the process of implementing treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements on a global level. Important advances have taken place in the international arena since the completion of this report, including the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the growing participation of indigenous peoples delegations from Asia, Africa and other regions of the world in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, this expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, and in other United Nations and international fora, and including as expert members. Mr. Chairperson, the development of human rights law is progressive. This is an underlying principle of international human rights law, as is the universal application of such rights without any form of discrimination. The Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus affirms the importance of the continued work on the matter of treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements for all indigenous peoples as well as for states and the United Nations system based on the aforesaid treaty study, but also looking forward in the light of the new developments and understandings from that same perspective of progressive development of international human rights law. We anticipate that the third seminar will be an important opportunity for all of us to advance this work. We look forward to discussing the provisions of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples pertaining to the implementation of treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements. Also of particular interest for indigenous peoples of all regions will be discussions on the development of frameworks for negotiation, redress, restitution and conflict resolution based on the affirmation in the preamble of the Indigenous Peoples Declaration that, I quote, treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements and the relationship they represent are the basis for a strengthened partnership between indigenous peoples and states, unquote. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson.